Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Enonic webinar. My name is Alan. I'm engineering manager at Enonic. In the first presentation, you will learn how in a matter of minutes you can create a site in XP using our freshly released React4XP starter, which fetches data via Headless API called Guillotine. Our first speaker is Espen Norderud, a senior developer at Enonic and the author of React4XP. But before he begins, we will give you a brief intro of what GraphQL is and how we used it in our Guillotine library to build Headless CMS API. So please welcome Thomas Sigistad, CTO of Enonic.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, Alan. So I won't go into all the details about what GraphQL is. I recommend everyone look it up. It's the short version is it's sort of the replacement for REST. It's a simpler, more predictable, and easier way to expose APIs over web. So what we did at Enonic is we built our own API on top of the CMS API, which is basically dynamically generated and exposing whatever you have made as a developer through this API. So short version, if you want to get started and just test the headless part of XP, I recommend visiting the developer portal and this guide, which is called the Headless CMS Starter. And it will take you basically through everything from building your own small app and setting up a project. And you can see I already have this project here where you have some sample data with persons and pictures and movies. And there's relationships between movies and people. And here you can, for instance, see here, Morgan Freeman plays Somerset, etc. And the beauty is you instantly get this API from your own app, from your own content types. So like you can see here, and here you can then instantly sort of figure out what's available and run queries like this one, where you ask to get any person, any person called Morgan, and then you extract some his picture, right? Or you can get all movies and get people in the movies, etc. So it's just a sample of how to use our GraphQL API. And this is like a read-only API, so it's low risk to place this on top of your content. But you can also protect it if you like with identity providers. And you can even customize it, so you can go in and change or extend the API with your own fields and capabilities as required. So that's like a super quick intro. Short version is build your XP app, just add the so-called Guillotine library, and you get this headless API on top of your site. So with that basic intro, I'll leave it to Espen to talk about how this is integrated into the React4XP project.
Thank you, Thomas. So, short about React4XP, that's a sort of a wrapper and a combined compilation suite for XP, which it has a starter of its own. And yesterday, we released a new version of the starter, which includes a little bit of boilerplate to make it easier to integrate Guillotine requests. What we see here, the Guillotine API, is a controller that allows that wraps the Guillotine library so that you can make quick backend requests from controllers or expose a front-end post endpoint. So you can make the same requests from the backend and the front end. There's also this one, Guillotine request, which is basically it basically just wraps the fetch command, which makes it easier to run a special Guillotine request, and then you can plug your own callbacks into it for handling different functions. So this simplifies the part where you want your web page to make calls to the backend and fetch some data. Guillotine is a read-only wrapper for GraphQL, so it's a pretty simple way to make advanced and flexible requests for data from the backend. So we're going to look at an example of that. What we're going to do today, we're going to try to build an infinite scroller, a page that lists some movies to begin with and adds some more movies as we scroll downwards. All of this does not come with the starter. I'm going to pretend we're adding it as we go. So we're starting with this movie.xml, which is a content type. This is just for demonstration purposes. It's pretty similar to what Thomas just showed us about the movies. What we have here is an image selector where we can insert a poster. We can describe the movie with an HTML area. We can say what year it's been released and what actors, an array of just strings played in it. And there's also a PNG just to mark the content type in Content Studio.
Espen, just a quick question. So to get going with React4XP, you just go to the starter, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So everything you need to get going is basically in the documentation.
Yes, and that has both an introduction to React4XP and a tutorial. So what I will do is I will post a link to the React4XP intro in the chat after I'm done with this demo. So basically, you don't have to keep up with the details of what's going on. Just try to focus on the big picture. So we're going to start with adding some React components to visualize this movie on a web page. What we have right now is this. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen.
Yeah,
it's visible. Yeah, so this is in Content Studio. We have this content type. It doesn't visualize anything right now. It's just the setup that we just made. So how to start by visualizing that? What we're doing is we're adding a so-called entry, which is a React component that is available to React4XP in a pretty simple way that we'll show you in a moment. This one is simply a reference to this one. So this is the React component that actually does the visualization of a single movie. What we have here, it's a function that takes in a little bit of props and it wraps it in some HTML markup and nests other components. Here we have a poster on the right and an info container with the rest of the information on the left. And the components are also importing a little bit of CSS so that we can style the whole thing too. And each nested component imports its own CSS. So we get here sort of a hierarchy of React components that nests each other. That's pretty standard procedure. There's a separation here between entries and shared components, and that's because entries are the files we want to have available to React4XP, while the ones that are not, we might as well bundle down to a one common bundle. So there are less assets to keep up with for the front end and more optimization too. So we get one shared bundle and we get the movie and later the movie list entries that are available to React4XP. So some basic startup for React4XP, we're going to have to start with this, the React4XP.properties. When you start with the starter, these will be empty, chunk dirs and entry dirs. So we're adding shared here and entries here relative to the parent folder here, React4XP. So now we're marking this as the one where entries are found, and this as the one where a shared chunk should be compiled. And also, this will usually be commented out. So we've commented it in, referring to a Webpack file. This one, and this Webpack file gives React4XP additional Webpack rules. So what we gain by this is that we get the ability to import styles the way I showed you. We have a Sass loader, which pipes into a CSS loader, and then the extract plugin loader. So what all this does is it gets all of these Sass files and just extracts them to CSS assets that can be read directly from the front end. So all of this is pretty standard. In order to get the data from a single movie routed into this one, we're going to make a part, a single movie part here. So this is defined like this. There's no config here. We have a controller, and all it does is fetch some contents, and it uses that data to populate a props object with the image URL, the title, the description, the year, and the actors. And what's important is that this props object matches the final props that's required by the component at the end.
I guess, Espen, we should also mention that this parts thing is an XP specific thing as well.
Yes.
Where it's all about doing a server-side rendering here.
Yes.
So these are server-side components.
Exactly. So what we're doing when we're unpacking the props like this is we can call React4XP's render methods with a reference to the entry, the movie.jsx. We send it the props and the request, and that's just part of what React4XP requires. That's presented in the introduction that we'll link to later. Okay. So I'm going to do, sorry. The React4XP requires npm install to have been run at the very first step. And that's because parts of the build that the starter links to is actually fetched from node modules. Let's see here. The starter also is very bare bone in what npm packages it has. So we're going to have to add some for the styling to work. These ones here. So we're just going to rush through that. And that's the only thing we're going to install like this. Now we're ready to build it. Let you see a little bit more of the code.
I guess people might be wondering what's on your right there. Is this your script?
All of this on my right is my script. That's part of the improvisation. You weren't supposed to see that at all. So there we have it built. Now we can, if we, let's see, we reload Content Studio and then we go down to the templates. Here we have a single movie template. It's a content item that I made. It catches all the movie items, and we want to use this to visualize any movie. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add the part for a single movie. Oops. Just going to drag it in like this. Here we have single movie. And what we see here is that it sort of renders. Right now, this is a rendering without any data. So what we just get is these placeholders. But if we now look at a single movie, then we get the data just visualized by XP.
So Espen, this is server-side generated, right?
This is server-side generated. And what we're going to do here is that these single movie visualizations, we're going to use the exact same the exact same React components for visualizing the movies inside the list on both server-side and front-end later. So we're going to recycle quite a lot of code here.
So basically, this means you can reuse an existing React design system, for instance, or React components you might have built already.
Yes.
So that's typically a benefit now that people are building up these design systems and reusing across the various surfaces.
Yeah. The rule of thumb when you do that, just to say a little bit about that, is that the top level React component, which is probably the design system itself, I guess, depending on how that's laid out. The top level React component is an app by itself, and that's always an entry. An entry is a top level React app, and so depending on how that code is laid out, you might have to adapt to this form. It only wants a sort of a function that takes props and returns some React. You're not supposed to write react.render or react.dom.render. That's React4XP expects to be able to do that itself. So depending on how it is, that might require some adaptation. Okay, we're going to move on to the next thing, which is to visualize an entire list of movies. And we have here a part called movie list. I've added a little bit of config just to show that it's all dynamic as we go. We can define how many movies we want it to display at once. We have a little radio button and a checkbox that says how we want to sort them and if we want that to be reversed. And going back to the controller here, what this does is that it gets an item. In this case, it gets the movie site item itself, and it looks for the children of it. So we have all these movies here that are child items of movie site, and we want movie sites to use the movie list part to list all of these. What that does is it uses the config to make a sort expression. It runs a get children from regular content lib, and again, we populate movie items that match the signature of props in the movie JSX. We're also adding the ID. That's because when we look at the movie list itself, that's simple enough. It just maps out movie items from the movie's props that it gets. So that array gets mapped out into single items, and we're just reusing the same movie .jsx down here. Here's where we need the key in addition, the ID. So this is what we're going to build on to make all of this more headless and more dynamic. But for now, let's just look at the visualization. We already built this, so all we're going to need to do is to edit this. And here in the visualization, we're going to drag in the movie list part. Let's say we want 3 movies at a time by release year sorted. So there we go. What we have here now is single movies are visualized like we saw. This takes a little longer because I'm running it in dev mode, I think. Like this. Yeah. Okay. Right. So now we can move on to prepare, make some preparations for going headless. We're gonna look back at this Guillotine API. Like you presented earlier, we're going to use this a little more now, the helper for making Guillotine queries. So to start with, we're gonna change the list controller to make a query with Guillotine instead of with the content lib. And later on, we're also going to use the front end. We're going to use the post. So we're going to need to expose that API. All of this is included with the starter, but by default, it's disabled. The reason for that is that, whoops, I'm gonna get it from Git. Do a little bit of cheating. Here, what we're doing now is that we've gone to site XML, and under mappings, we connect the path API headless to the Guillotine API controller up here. The reason this is a manual step is that this controller is pretty bare. What you're doing is you're sending in any query, and the Guillotine engine will perform it for you. So, but in principle, anything will be readable, although it is just a read-only API, Guillotine. But it's
Espen, I think you have 2 levels of mappings there, so you probably have to clean up the...
Really? Ah, good catch. Thank you. Right. So we're adding this manual just to make sure that developers know what they're doing when they add this one. So what we recommend is, if you're going to use this in a project that's going into production, it's probably a good idea to implement some sort of security measure of your own, or at least having given it some kind of thoughts. Right. Now, if we rebuild this, now we will get the Guillotine API is now active. And let's see here. I'm just going to have to orient a little bit. Yes, there we go. So now we have an active endpoint. One thing that's really nice about Guillotine and GraphQL is that there's an app in XP that's called GraphQL, this one. And that's kind of a playground or a sandbox where you can, or a REPL if you want, where you can just mess around with your own queries like this. You can just add any query here. And if you map it to an active endpoint like this, you can run it. Right now we're getting a 404 because at the moment this is not an active endpoint. However, this one here, here's the URL that we just activated in site.xml. This is basically the end string that we defined, fixed after a site, the movie site URL. So if we run that, we're doing a live Guillotine API query. So we can mess around with variables here and so on. But just doing a query like this, here we're including all of the data right in the query. This just, we can use this string here from a web app, but it's pretty static. So we're going to try to parameterize all of this so that an endpoint can sort of just switch out some of the values and get a more usable query.
I guess I should also mention that in this headless starter, we're actually bundling the browsing interface with the application, so you could have a look at that as well.
Right.
And that's just an alternative to GraphQL, which is called GraphQL Playground.
Yeah.
So that's what I demonstrated earlier. So
yes. And if you're only using the React4XP starter, that one is not included, but you can go here on applications and install and just look it up here. Use it. I've already done here. When you mark it, you get the oops.
Yeah, and these tools can also be installed directly on your Mac or Windows machine as well. It's like a generic thing to browse GraphQL APIs.
Yes. So now this is the way to parameterize this this query. We declare a couple of variables at the top, and then we can use them like this. So first means we want the first X ones. That's actually a counter. So what we're saying here, if first is 3, we want 3 items. Offset is where we're starting, how many items we're skipping, sort of. And sort is the same sort expression that we used in the content lib earlier here. And so we add variables as a second field. So we're sending in both a query string and some variables that are inserted into the query string before running it, and we get this. Now we're basically simulating what's going to happen on the front end. Also, I think, yeah, here we can, I've added some logging just to get a readout of what's going on in a Guillotine query. We see it gets the query string, it gets the variables, it processes it, and makes this JSON data output. Right. So we can take that string and add it directly to our code. I'm going to skip a little bit, just a moment. Again, we're cheating and getting some code right from Git. Now, let's pretend I just made this module list helpers. That's, here we see the query that we just made. So we've checked in GraphQL that this is already working with these parameters. So what we want is a query string builder method, build query list movies. And I've actually added 2 parameters because I hadn't got time to figure out a way to parameterize the movie type and this on sentence here. So I'm just doing it simple like this. So that means we now have a way to build the query without having to know the app name up front, because that's included in the movie type. So the front end can take that as a parameter by itself and still get a working query. What we also have here is, if we look at this this data that's returned from the request, it doesn't exactly match what the signature of the props is. So we're going to have to make an adapter function that converts it. So what we're doing here is we're taking in the response from the Guillotine query and just massaging that and making the props that we need. So we're going to use both of these where we need them. Now, if we're going back to movie lists, we can add the code for that. We're switching out the content lib and just adding the Guillotine lib wrapper. And we're using the build query list movies for building the query string and the props maker that we just made from in the helpers. And when using them down here, it's going to look like this instead. So we're still defining the sort expression. We're saying what the movie type is. It's movie under our app name. We're using that to build the query string. We're adding some variables using the config from the movie list part. We're executing the query with the string and our variables. And we're turning the Guillotine result into some props we can use. So this is the props object now. And we're still referring to the movie list like we did before and asking React4XP to server-side render that.
So Espen, basically what you've done now is you have replaced like a traditional XP get content or query content
Yes.
with using the Guillotine library on the server side.
Yes. And so just to be precise, what we're doing on the controller doesn't matter to React4XP as long as React4XP gets the props that it needs. So we could just keep it like this. But one advantage of reusing the same query on the controller side and on the front-end side that we will add in a moment is that when that logic is the same, if anything changes, we need some other data or we rename something, we only have one single source of truth, one place it's defined. So there's less maintenance. This is called isomorphism, by the way. We're reusing a lot of the code on the back end and the front end. Okay, it's already built. Let's see if we can get it to work. Actually, we can just skip to a full page usage of that. Here's some kind of an error. Yeah, we just needed a refresh for some reason. So what we're seeing here is a pure server-side rendering. Okay, moving on. We're going to add some interactivity to the front end and see if we can repeat the same Guillotine request in the front end. And this is to sort of gradually approach a headless way of using this page we're building. We're going back to movie list, the entry. We're adding a few sort of housekeeping variables. And we're going to add some functionality. Here, we're adding an initialization phase where we just want to count what movie we're looking for in the search. We want that to increase for every time the search is made. So we're sort of going through the list, and we only want that to happen once. We're actually going to come back to a different way of using this that's better and more best practice React, but this is more of a simple way to display what's happening for now. We have we've started a make request function. It's not doing anything right now. It's just pretending to make a request. It says it's requesting something. We're requesting this many movies starting from that index. And then after it's done that, it ticks the next offset up by the number of movies we requested. And finally, we're mapping that make request method to a click listener in the list itself. And that means make request is going to be called every time we click somewhere in the list. Let's reload here. It takes a couple of seconds every time we rebuild the app because the React4XP engine server-side rendering is caching the functions. So I don't know if it's visible, but what we're seeing here in the console is requesting 3 movies starting from index 6, 9, etc. Pretty simple. In order to actually do the request from here, we're going to need a little bit of more data. So we're going to add some props so that the movie list entry can know a little bit more about what it's doing. And that's these. I'm still getting a list of movies, but now we're also getting the URL to the Guillotine endpoint, parent path, and movie count, and movie type, and sort expression are all parameters that build the query string. And later on here, we're going to send that data from the movie list controller. Like that. And now that we have this data, we can import the same helper methods that we used in the controller earlier. So like this. This is the query list string, and this is the props generator. And also this one, the do guillotine request from the guillotine quest, that's the helper that wraps a front-end query. So we're just importing those methods at the front end here in the component. And we're going to used that. What I changed now was that I updated the make request method that's called on the click. We're calling do guillotine request. We're giving it the URL to the API. We're building a query string and adding that as the query. We're building the variables. And so far, this is pretty similar to what we did on the front end. And then we're inserting or injecting two references to functions that's going to be needed. This is the one that converted the guillotine result to the to props, and handle data func is the callback that's called at the end on the final data. What we want this all to end with, when we've done our guillotine request, we want it to end here. And what this does, update DOM with new movies, it's not going to do that yet, but we just want to mark that this is what's going on. So we're just logging that we received the data and still ticking the next offset after we've added the data. I'm not going to build and show that just yet. You probably get the idea, I'm guessing. So we're going to save a little bit of time. And
so Espen, we're at 9:45 for your information now.
Thank you. We're going to go straight to rendering. And in order to render and to update without refreshing the entire page, React is, as many of you know, a very dynamically oriented framework. So we're going to use a component state. This is a hook, which is pretty recent feature in React. What we're about to do is to it could have been done with an old style class component, which has a state handling of its own. Use state or hooks is React's more recent way of handling lifecycle events in React from pure functional components like this. This is all an arrow function. There's no class and so on. So what we can do here, we're replacing the initialization. Here we're first fetching the state, and we're initializing the state with the props that we got. So the first rendering state becomes this movie list. It's going to be handy for us to have a handle for the movie list container rendering at the end. So we're just making a unique ID on that. We're giving the list the ID, still keeping the on-click here, make request clicker. And instead of just saying movies, we're now saying state movies, which means that whatever is rendered comes from the state instead of directly from the props. And that means that whenever the state is changed, React will render that and update that dynamically and really fast too. So all we need to do now is to update the DOM new movies method. All that needs to do is to take the the result that it gets from the guillotine request and insert that into the state, and then we get a truly dynamic web page. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip to the code where that is working. What was added here is a method that initializes a scroll listener in the DOM on the first rendering. And finally, when make request has got a result and triggers update DOM, what we're basically doing is using the setState method that we got further up and just inserting the new movie items that we're getting into the state. What we're also doing is that we're switching off the scroll listener while this is going on here. So as soon as it triggers a scroll, or actually what we're doing is we're listening for scrolls that are down to a certain distance from the bottom here. That creates a trigger, turns off the scroll listener, and does the make request. And at the end, when the movies are added, we turn the listener back on. Oops, sorry.
So Espen, how does this hook stuff relate to the server side? Is it relevant at all?
Actually, no. What the server-side rendering does is only visualize what the React rendering will look like from the first initial props. All the rest of this, use state, use effect, scroll listeners, and so on, is dynamic stuff going on the browser side, and that's just skipped by the server.
So basically, you can deliver like an instant first response that includes data.
Yes, and that's going to
rather than having spinners or initialization stuff going on.
Exactly.
And then you can allow that to happen, and then sort of provide like a transparency.
Yes.
Fast initial rendering and dynamic combined, right?
Yes. Now the first rendering is not so fast because React4XP is warming up on the first single rendering, but what we get is this. This is just the initial rendering, but now we see that it triggers when we reach the bottom and fills with more movies. And we can see in the console here what's actually going on. It triggers, fetches more movie data, and populates the DOM with that until we reach the end, which we've done here. It gets nothing more.
And basically, so you're using the same query, the same presentation template, both server side and front end.
Yes, and
you have to add this logic then to paginate on the front end.
Exactly. This is actually a write-out of the first response from XP. So what you can see here is the server-side rendering. These are the first items that are rendered on the server side, but everything after that is just dynamic queries. What we've added now is this. We have a web app now. As you can see here, the controller of the web app doesn't do anything except render an HTML. And that HTML, it gets React from CDNs. These are the public CDNs. And it just loads the assets that have been compiled by React4XP. It gives a container where this is supposed to be rendered. This part could have been a spinner. It's going to be replaced, but for now we're just saying load movies. And we're initializing some data and loading a script down here. And all of this could have been served and handled any way you want. The point is just initializing the data and loading the assets. So what the script does is, that's the asset here. The script just recycles the same methods we've built before. I had to do it this way because of I didn't want to mess with the build in order to be able to import stuff here. But it's the same logic as we've done earlier. We're making an initial Guillotine request the same way as we did on the back end before. We're populating some props, adding that to a props object, with the same data as earlier. And finally, we're creating a component with the name of the entry. All of this is vanilla React. So on the front end here, React4XP is not part of the equation anymore. All React4XP was doing is to do the compilation of these assets. And finally, we target an element and load the component into that. So what that gives us is this.
Espen, we have to wrap up. We're running out of time.
Here we go. This is all front end with the same components as before. And that's
so basically, Espen, short version is you're delivering the web app from XP as well, right?
Yes, but in this case, it could have been delivered from anywhere.
Sure. But it's nice to know that you can deliver both the web app and the data from XP if you like to.
Yeah. So basically, this is a headless solution. What we're doing is we have content that we can make in Content Studio and deliver any way we want.
Okay, great.